The wind in Montana doesn't just blow. It screams across the open plains like a living thing that is trying to find a way inside your lungs. I stood on the porch of the main ranch house, watching the snow bury the gravel driveway in a thick, suffocating blanket of white. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, a time when the world should have been dead and silent, but the cattle in the north pasture were lowing in a way that sounded like pure, unadulterated panic. My father had always told me that animals see things long before we do, and as I gripped the cold steel of my flashlight, I felt a heavy knot of dread tightening in the pit of my stomach. The ranch was isolated, a sprawling kingdom of grass and wire that sat 20 miles from the nearest paved road and even further from anyone who could hear a scream. I stepped off the porch, my boots sinking deep into the fresh powder, and the silence of the night was broken only by the rhythmic crunching of my footsteps. I headed toward the equipment shed to grab the keys to the heavy-duty Polaris, thinking about the phone call I had tried to make just 10 minutes earlier. The landline was dead, which wasn't unusual in a storm, but the cell tower on the ridge was dark, and that was something that never happened unless someone had climbed the service ladder and cut the power. Every shadow cast by the barn looked like a crouching figure, and I found myself swinging the flashlight beam wildly, searching for eyes reflecting back at me in the dark. As I drove the Polaris toward the north boundary, the headlights cut through the swirling snow, revealing the first sign that something was horribly wrong. The heavy steel gate that led to the upper grazing lands was standing wide open, its heavy chain dangling uselessly in the wind. This wasn't a mistake made by a lazy ranch hand, because I had personally locked that gate at sundown and tucked the key into my pocket. I climbed out of the vehicle, the engine idling with a low growl that felt like the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. I knelt in the snow and saw something that made my blood turn to ice. There were boot prints leading through the gate, but they weren't mine and they weren't coming from the road. They were coming from the direction of the house, trailing me from the moment I had stepped out onto the porch. I realized then that I wasn't out here hunting for a trespasser, but rather, I had been lured out into the open by someone who knew exactly how I would react to the sound of distressed cattle. I looked back toward the house, which was now just a dim, flickering yellow light in the distance, and I saw a silhouette standing on the very porch I had just left. The figure was tall and motionless, holding something long and thin that glinted in the moonlight like a pair of industrial wire cutters. I scrambled back into the Polaris and slammed it into gear, my hands shaking so violently that I nearly stalled the engine. I didn't head back to the house, because I knew the intruder was already there, waiting for me to return to the safety of my own front door. Instead, I turned the vehicle toward the dense tree-line of the creek bed, hoping the thick brush would hide my movement while I tried to circle around. The cattle were still screaming, a horrific, guttural sound that told me someone was hurting them just to keep me distracted and focused on the noise. I killed the headlights and navigated by the dim glow of the moon, the world turning into a landscape of gray and black ghosts. Suddenly, the Polaris hit a dip in the ground and the engine sputtered, the cold air finally winning the battle against the old battery. I sat there in the sudden, deafening silence, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. That was when I heard it. The sound of a metal blade snapping shut, followed by the high-pitched ping of a high-tension fence wire being severed. It was close, maybe 30 yards to my left, and it was rhythmic, as if someone were systematically deconstructing the world around me. I realized they weren't trying to catch me yet. They were cutting the perimeter fences to ensure that no matter which way I ran, I would eventually become entangled in the rusted coils of barbed wire. I abandoned the vehicle and began to crawl through the snow, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps that I tried to muffle with my gloved hand. I needed to reach the old hunting blind near the ridge, a sturdy wooden structure that had a lock on the inside and a clear view of the valley. Every time a branch snapped or the wind shifted a drift of snow, I froze, certain that a hand was about to reach out of the darkness and grab my ankle. The psychological weight of being hunted on your own land is a special kind of torture, as every familiar landmark becomes a potential hiding spot for a killer. I reached the base of the ridge and began the slow, agonizing climb upward, my fingers numbing as I gripped the frozen rocks. When I finally reached the blind, I didn't go inside immediately. I crouched behind a fallen cedar tree and waited, watching the path I had just taken. Sure enough, A few minutes later, a dark shape emerged from the blizzard, moving with a terrifying, predatory grace. It wasn't a ghost or a monster, but a man in a heavy canvas coat, his face obscured by a thermal mask that made him look like a featureless void. He stopped exactly where I had tripped over a log, tilting his head as if he were sniffing the air for the scent of my fear. He held the wire cutters in one hand and a long, serrated hunting knife in the other, tapping the blade against his thigh in a slow, impatient beat. He began to move toward the blind, his footsteps deliberate and heavy, showing a level of confidence that suggested he had done this many times before. I knew I couldn't outrun him in the deep snow, and I knew that if he reached the stairs of the blind, I would be trapped like a rat in a box. I looked around and saw a heavy iron pry bar leaning against the base of the structure, left behind from the summer repairs. I didn't wait for him to find me. I lunged for the bar and swung it with every ounce of desperate strength I had left in my body. The metal connected with his shoulder with a sickening thud, and he let out a sharp, surprised grunt as he tumbled backward into a deep snowdrift. I didn't stay to see if he would get up, and I didn't try to finish the fight, because the look in his eyes during that split second of contact told me he wasn't alone. I ran toward the ridgeline where the old logging road began, a path that was mostly gravel and stayed clear of the deepest snow. I ran until my lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, and I didn't stop until I saw the distant, swaying headlights of a snowplow clearing the county road miles away. I flagged the driver down, my voice a broken rasp as I tried to explain that there was a man on my ranch who was tearing the world apart piece by piece. By the time the sheriff's deputies arrived at the house 3 hours later, the intruder was gone, but the evidence of his presence was everywhere. Every single strand of the perimeter fence had been cut, miles of wire coiled and tangled like a spiderweb across the property. Inside the house, they found my kitchen table set for 2 people, with 2 plates of raw meat and a single, handwritten note that simply said, "Next time, don't leave the gate open." I never went back to that ranch alone, and to this day, the sound of a snapping wire is enough to make me stop breathing, wondering if he's still out there in the dark, waiting for the wind to scream again. The isolation of a fire lookout tower is a beautiful dream for the first week, but by the 3rd month, the silence starts to feel like a predator that is slowly circling your mind. I was stationed in the Heartwood National Forest, perched in a glass-walled box on stilts that sat 60 feet above the canopy and 40 miles from the nearest human soul. My job was simple: scan the horizon for the thin, gray plumes of smoke that signaled a forest fire and report the coordinates over the long-range radio. The heat of the day would bake the small room until the air felt heavy and metallic, but the nights were different, turning the forest below into a vast, undulating sea of black ink. It was a Tuesday night when the static on my radio changed from a gentle hiss into something that sounded like a rhythmic, wet clicking. I was sitting at the small wooden desk, trying to read a paperback novel by the light of a battery-powered lamp, when the speaker crackled to life. I reached out to adjust the squelch, thinking it was just atmospheric interference from a passing storm front, but then a voice broke through the white noise. It wasn't the gravelly tone of the dispatchers back in the valley. It was a soft, melodic whisper that sounded like it was coming from right behind my shoulder. "I can see the light in your window, Elias," the voice said, and my heart stopped because I had never given my name over the public channel. I gripped the plastic handset, my knuckles turning white as I stared out into the darkness where the stairs descended into the trees. "This is Lookout Station 7. Who is this?" I asked, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to sound professional and calm. There was no immediate response, only that strange, wet clicking sound that seemed to sync up with the rhythm of my own frantic breathing. I peered through the glass, but the reflection of my own lamp made it impossible to see anything beyond the catwalk railing. I reached over and flicked the exterior floodlights on, the powerful beams cutting through the gloom and illuminating the tops of the pine trees. The radio hissed again, more urgent this time, the voice sounding closer and more distorted by the low-end frequencies. "You shouldn't have done that, Elias. The light makes it much easier for me to find the ladder rungs in the dark." I scrambled to the window and looked straight down at the base of the tower, my stomach turning into a cold pit of lead. At the very bottom of the steel structure, standing right next to the heavy propane tanks, was a person wearing a bright yellow rain slicker that looked brand new. They weren't looking up. They were just standing there, holding a portable radio to their face and swaying slowly from side to side. I realized then that my only way down was the narrow, vertical ladder that the stranger was currently guarding. I grabbed the heavy iron fire poker from beside the small stove and retreated to the center of the room, far away from the glass walls. "I'm calling the Rangers," I shouted into the radio. Even though I knew the nearest patrol was at least 3 hours away on a good day, the voice on the speaker laughed, a dry, rattling sound that made the hair on my arms stand up like needles. "The wires at the base of the tower have already been dealt with, Elias. Your long-range antenna is just a piece of scrap metal now. We are on a dead channel, and nobody is coming to help you tonight." I looked at the signal meter on my console and saw the needle drop to 0, the red error light blinking like a mocking heartbeat. I was trapped in a glass cage 60 feet in the air, and the only thing between me and the person in the yellow slicker was a trapdoor with a simple sliding bolt. I heard the first metallic ping of a heavy boot hitting the bottom rung of the ladder, the sound vibrating up through the steel legs of the tower and into the floorboards. They were coming up, and they weren't in any hurry because they knew I had nowhere else to go. I began to pile everything I had against the trapdoor: my heavy wooden trunk, the spare batteries, and the small refrigerator. I worked in a feverish silence, listening to the rhythmic clank, clank, clank of the climber getting closer and closer. Every few minutes, the radio would burst into life with a snippet of a song or a whispered nursery rhyme, a psychological tactic designed to break my resolve. I realized that this person didn't just want to hurt me. They wanted me to feel the full weight of my helplessness before they reached the top. The climbing stopped about 10 feet below the floor of the tower, and for a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind whistling through the struts. Then, I heard a heavy thud against the underside of the floor, followed by the sound of something sharp scratching against the wood. They were looking for a gap, a way to pry the door open from the outside. I stood over the trapdoor, clutching the fire poker, ready to strike at the first finger that appeared through the wood. "Why are you doing this?" I yelled, my voice cracking with a mixture of rage and terror. The radio on the desk chirped one last time, the voice now sounding calm and almost bored. "Because you're the only thing out here that's alive, and I've been alone in these woods for a very long time." The scratching stopped, and I heard the person begin to descend the ladder, the metal ringing out in the night air. I didn't feel relief. I felt a deeper, more profound sense of dread, wondering if this was just another trick to get me to open the door. I stayed slumped over my barricade for hours, watching the sun slowly bleed over the horizon, turning the forest from black to a bruised purple. When the morning light finally filled the valley, I gathered the courage to move the trunk and peer through the small gap in the floor. The ladder was empty, and the person in the yellow slicker was nowhere to be seen in the clearing below. I climbed down with the fire poker tucked into my belt, my eyes scanning every bush and shadow for a flash of yellow. When I reached the ground, I saw that the radio cables had indeed been sliced clean through with a pair of heavy shears. But it was what I found pinned to the bottom rung of the ladder that made me leave the forest and never look back. It was a Polaroid photo, still damp from the morning dew, showing me asleep in my chair from the night before. The photo had been taken from inside the tower, through the glass, while I had been reading my book and before I had ever turned on the floodlights. He hadn't been waiting at the bottom of the tower for me to arrive. He had been watching me from the catwalk for hours, waiting for the exact moment I realized I was no longer alone. I ran to my truck and drove until I hit the interstate, leaving the silence of the Heartwood Forest behind me forever. The Louisiana Bayou at night is not a place of peace. It is a landscape of ancient, rotting trees and water, so still it looks like polished obsidian. I had been paddling my kayak for 6 hours, guided only by the pale light of a crescent moon and the low-profile GPS mounted to my deck. I was deep in the Atchafalaya Basin, a maze of cypress knees and hanging Spanish moss that could swallow a man whole and leave no trace behind. My plan was to find a dry patch of ground to pitch my hammock, but as the humidity settled over the water like a wet blanket, I realized the channel markers I had been following were no longer visible. The first sign of trouble wasn't a sound, but a ripple in the water that didn't match the rhythm of my own paddle strokes. I stopped moving, holding my breath until my chest felt tight, and watched as a long V-shaped wake cut across the surface of the black water behind me. It wasn't an alligator because they don't move with that kind of mechanical precision, and they certainly don't carry the faint, metallic scent of diesel exhaust. A small, flat-bottomed boat was drifting through the trees about 50 yards back. Its engine cut to a low hum that was almost indistinguishable from the buzzing of the cicadas. It had no lights, no registration numbers, and the person standing at the helm was nothing more than a tall, dark shadow against the gray moss. I began to paddle faster, my heart thumping against my ribs as I steered my kayak into a narrow, overgrown slough where the cypress trees grew so thick they blocked out the sky. I told myself it was just a local fisherman or a poacher who didn't want to be seen, but the way they turned their boat to follow my exact path suggested something far more predatory. Every time I looked over my shoulder, the shadow was there, gliding silently through the water, closing the gap between us with terrifying ease. How did they know which turn I had taken in this labyrinth of identical trees without a single light to guide them? The water in the slough began to get shallower, the bottom of my kayak scraping against submerged logs with a sound like a bone breaking. I reached a dead end where a massive, fallen oak tree blocked the entire channel, its tangled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I was trapped, and as I turned my kayak around, I saw the dark boat emerge from the mist, blocking the only exit back to the main river. The man at the helm didn't speak, but he pulled a heavy, waterproof flashlight from his belt and clicked it on, the blinding white beam hitting me directly in the eyes. "You're a long way from the tourist trails, aren't you?" he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate through the floor of my kayak. He didn't sound angry. He sounded like a man who had finally found something he had been looking for all night. I squinted against the light, trying to see his face, but all I could see were the edges of a tattered camo jacket and the glint of a heavy metal chain draped over the side of his boat. He reached down and picked up a long pole with a hooked end, the kind used for hauling heavy nets out of the muck, and began to pull his boat closer to mine. I realized then that if he got close enough to hook my kayak, I would be at his mercy in the middle of a swamp where the mud was deep enough to act like quicksand. I didn't have a weapon, but I had my heavy carbon fiber paddle and a small flare gun in my emergency kit. I reached into the dry bag between my legs, my fingers fumbling with the plastic latch while the man continued to pull himself toward me. "I have a GPS tracker on this boat," I lied, my voice cracking as the adrenaline flooded my system. "People know exactly where I am, and they'll be looking for me by morning." The man laughed, a wet, rattling sound that made my skin crawl, and he didn't stop moving for a second. "Nobody finds anything in the black water unless the swamp wants them to find it," he replied, and he lunged forward with the hook, catching the edge of my cockpit. The kayak jolted violently, nearly tipping me into the dark, snake-infested water, and I felt the cold splash of the bayou against my arms. I didn't think. I just acted, grabbing the flare gun and pointing it directly at the oily water between our two vessels. I pulled the trigger, and the world exploded in a brilliant, blinding flash of crimson light as the magnesium flare hissed across the surface. It didn't hit him, but it ignited a pocket of swamp gas and old oil that had settled on the water, creating a sudden curtain of fire between us. The man let out a roar of frustration and dropped the hook as the heat scorched the side of his wooden boat. In that moment of chaos, I used my paddle to shove off the fallen oak tree, forcing my kayak through a small gap in the branches that I hadn't seen before. I paddled like a madman, the red glow of the fire behind me casting long, distorted shadows across the trees. I didn't follow the GPS anymore. I followed the flow of the water, pushing through thick mats of duckweed and spiderwebs that coated my face and hair. I could hear the man's engine roar to life as he cleared the fire, the sound of the propeller chewing through the vegetation as he gave chase. But the swamp is a fickle place, and the narrow gap I had squeezed through was too small for his flat-bottomed boat to follow. I spent the rest of the night shivering in the dark, hidden deep inside a hollowed-out cypress stump, listening to the sound of that engine circling the perimeter of my hiding spot. Every time the boat got close, I held my breath, watching the beam of his flashlight sweep across the leaves just inches from my head. It wasn't until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the canopy that the sound of the motor finally faded away toward the south. I eventually found my way back to the main channel and flagged down a park ranger patrol boat 3 hours later. When I told them about the man and the boat, the ranger's face went pale, and he looked out over the water with a grim expression. He told me that they had found 3 empty kayaks in that same area over the last 2 years, all of them scuttled and weighed down with heavy chains. I sold my kayak the very next day because I realized that in the middle of the bayou, the most dangerous thing in the water isn't the alligators. It's the people who have learned how to hide in the shadows.